What started as another day of routine patrol at Buckingham Palace would end with one of the most viral moments in Royal Guard history. This is the story of how a single word from a motionless sentry brought down an empire of followers and changed the life of a girl who thought the whole world was her stage. Madison Chase had never heard the word no and meant it. At 19, she commanded an army of 12 million TikTok followers who hung on her every dance move, every outfit change, every perfectly curated moment of her supposedly authentic life. Her pink Lamborghini was parked 3 blocks away, her designer heels clicked against Centra's old cobblestones, and her phone was already recording before she'd even decided what she was going to do. The morning sun caught the sequins on her crop top as she surveyed the scene before her. Tourists, cameras, and in the center of it all, the perfect backdrop for her next viral moment. A royal guard stood at attention, his scarlet uniform blazing against the gray stone walls, his bare skin had adding an air of timeless authority to the scene. Madison smiled the same practiced smile that had launched 1,000 brand partnerships. This was going to be easy, just another prop in another performance for another million views. She'd danced in front of the Eiffel Tower, twerked at Times Square, and made content at every major landmark from Tokyo to Dubai. How hard could one British soldier be? She positioned herself just close enough to get the guard in frame, but far enough away to avoid any potential issues. At least, that's what she thought. The morning crowd began to notice her setup, phones emerging from pockets as people recognized the famous face preparing for another spectacle. "Hey guys, Madison here," she chirped into her phone camera, her voice carrying that particular inflection that defined a generation of content creators. "So I'm here at Buckingham Palace, and I thought, why not teach this gorgeous guard one of my signature dances? This is going to be absolutely iconic." The guard's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. His breathing was steady, controlled, measured, but there was something in his stillness that should have warned Madison. Something that spoke of discipline forged in fire, of duty that transcended personal comfort, of a commitment that ran deeper than anything her generation typically understood. But Madison wasn't listening to warnings. She was listening to the imaginary sound of hearts and comments and shares that would follow this moment. She was already composing the caption in her head, already picturing the brand deals that would follow, already calculating the engagement rates that would make her manager dance with joy. The music started, not live music, but the tinny, artificial sound bleeding from her phone's speakers as she pressed play on her latest choreographed routine. The beat was aggressive, modern, designed to grab attention in the 3-second window that determines success or failure on social media platforms. Madison began to move. Her routine was precise, rehearsed, calculated for maximum visual impact. Hip swings that would drive engagement through the roof. Hair flips that would generate millions of screenshots. Facial expressions that walked the line between innocent and provocative with surgical precision. The crowd began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of youth and energy performing against the backdrop of ancient tradition. Phones emerged like flowers blooming in fast forward, each one capturing a different angle of what everyone assumed would be another harmless tourist moment. But as Madison's dance grew more elaborate, she began to drift closer to the guard. It wasn't intentional at first. The rhythm of the music, the excitement of the performance, the intoxicating rush of feeling hundreds of eyes watching her every move. She was living in the moment, lost in the performance, forgetting that some stages have boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed. The guard noticed, of course he noticed. These men were trained to notice everything, to assess every threat, to maintain awareness of their surroundings with military precision. But his training also taught him patience, restraint, the wisdom of measured response rather than immediate reaction. Madison spun closer, her movements becoming more daring as the music built toward its climax. Her followers would love this, the contrast between her modern energy and his ancient stillness. The collision of two worlds, two generations, to completely different ways of existing in the world. She reached out during one particularly elaborate move, her manicured fingernails brushing against the brass buttons of his red tunic. It was just a touch, barely contact at all, but it might as well have been a lightning strike. The guard's entire being focused down to that single point of contact, that breach of protocol that couldn't be ignored. Still, he held his position. Still, he maintained his composure, but something had shifted in the quality of his stillness. What had been patient endurance was now active resistance. What had been professional duty was now personal resolve. Madison didn't notice the change. She was too lost in her performance, too caught up in the rush of creating content that would define her career. She spun again, and this time her hand deliberately reached for his rifle. Not to take it, not to harm anyone, but simply because it would look amazing in the video. Simply because her followers would go crazy for such a bold move. Her fingers made contact with the cold metal of the weapon, and everything changed. The word came like thunder on a clear day, like the crack of a whip in perfect silence, like the voice of authority cutting through the noise of modern chaos with surgical precision. Stop. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was simply spoken with the kind of quiet authority that had commanded armies, ended wars, and shaped the destiny of nations. One word, delivered with perfect control and absolute finality. Madison froze mid-spin, her eyes wide with shock. In her 19 years of life, she'd never heard her name spoken with such complete authority. She'd never encountered a force that couldn't be charmed, influenced, or bought with the currency of youth and beauty and social media fame. The music continued to play from her phone, but it sounded different now. Tinny and artificial against the weight of that single word. The crowd that had been enjoying the show now held its collective breath, sensing that something fundamental had just shifted in the dynamic before them. For the first time in the encounter, the guard's eyes moved. Just his eyes, not his head, not his posture, but those pale blue eyes that had seen combat in Afghanistan, that had stood vigil over state funerals, that had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior under stress. Those eyes found Madison's face and held it with the intensity of a spotlight. Not angry, not cruel, not even particularly interested. Just completely, utterly unmoved by everything she represented. Her beauty, her fame, her millions of followers, her carefully cultivated image of desirability and influence. In that gaze, Madison saw herself as she truly was. Not a content creator or an influencer or a social media star. Just a 19-year-old girl who had confused attention with respect, followers with friends, and popularity with power. The phone in her hand continued recording, capturing every moment of her humiliation in high definition for the entire world to see. But for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about the content. She wasn't calculating engagement rates or planning her next move. She was simply standing there, small and exposed, in front of a man who represented everything she didn't understand about duty, honor, and service to something greater than oneself. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the continued music bleeding from her phone's speakers. The guard's expression didn't change. His eyes held hers for another heartbeat, then returned to their fixed point on the horizon. The moment was over, but its impact would last forever. Madison fumbled with her phone, stopping the recording with shaking hands. The crowd around them began to disperse, but she knew the damage was done. Someone else's phones had captured the moment. Someone else's video would go viral. But this time, she wouldn't be the hero of the story. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison stood there, her phone clutched in trembling hands, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She'd been stopped, not by security, not by police, not by management. By a single word from a man who hadn't moved a muscle except to speak. Around them, the mourning crowd had transformed. What had started as casual entertainment had become something else entirely. Tourists who had been smiling and recording were now exchanging uncomfortable glances. Parents pulled their children a little closer. The energy had shifted from amusement to something that felt almost sacred. Madison's mind raced through her options. She could laugh it off, make a joke, turn this into content about how strict British security was. She could play the victim, claim she was just having fun, that the guard had overreacted. She could spin this into sympathy, into outrage, into anything that would preserve her image and protect her brand. But something in that single word had cut through all her practiced responses. Something in the way it had been delivered with such quiet authority that it had silenced not just her body but her entire performative persona. For the first time in years, Madison Chase the brand had been stripped away, leaving just Madison the person, confused and small in a world much larger than her phone screen. The guard remained motionless, but his presence had somehow grown larger. What had been a colorful backdrop for her performance had revealed itself to be something else entirely. This wasn't a prop or a tourist attraction. This was a human being with a job to do, a duty to uphold, a responsibility that transcended entertainment value. A young British woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone raised with different values. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, not shouting but speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't a theme park. This isn't your personal studio. Show some respect." The words hit Madison like physical blows. Respect. It was a word she heard often in her comments, usually preceded by demands for it rather than discussions of giving it. Her millions of followers respected her content, her style, her ability to entertain them. But when was the last time she had shown respect to anyone else? More voices joined in, not angry but disappointed. A tourist from Germany shook his head and muttered something in his native language that needed no translation. An elderly couple from Scotland looked at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for witnessing bad parenting in public spaces. Madison's phone buzzed with notifications. The algorithm had already picked up on her activity, suggesting she post the content while engagement was high. But for the first time in her career, she couldn't imagine actually uploading what she'd just recorded. The video showed her at her most confident, most entitled, most convinced of her own importance. And then it showed the moment when all of that crumbled with a single word. The guard's partner, stationed at the opposite post, maintained his own perfect stillness. But there was something in his posture that suggested solidarity, support, a shared understanding of duty that transcended individual moments of difficulty. This wasn't just about one guard dealing with one disrespectful tourist. This was about a brotherhood, a tradition, a commitment that stretched back through centuries. Madison found herself studying the guard's face properly for the first time. Beneath the ceremonial formality, she could see signs of actual humanity. Lines around his eyes that spoke of years of service. A jaw set with determination that suggested personal sacrifice for professional duty. This wasn't a character in her content. This was a real person with a real job that required real dedication. "I didn't mean ... double quotes," she started to say, then stopped because she had meant it. She'd meant to use him as a prop. She'd meant to turn his workplace into her stage. She'd meant to treat his duty as her entertainment. The intentions had been clear, even if the consequences hadn't been considered. The guard's eyes found hers again, and this time there was something different in his gaze. Not anger, but something almost like disappointment. As if he'd expected better from someone her age, someone with her platform, someone with her obvious intelligence and resources. That disappointment hurt worse than anger would have. Anger she could fight against, could turn into content about unfair treatment or British rudeness. But disappointment was harder to spin. Disappointment suggested that she'd had the opportunity to be better and had chosen not to be. For several long minutes, they stood in this uncomfortable tableau. The guard at his post, Madison frozen in the aftermath of her humiliation, the crowd uncertain whether to stay and watch or leave and forget what they'd witnessed. Time seemed suspended, as if the universe was waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. Then something unexpected happened. Madison's phone rang. Not a notification or a social media alert, but an actual phone call. The ringtone was jarringly modern against the historical weight of the moment, but she answered it reflexively. Madison, darling. Her manager's voice was sharp with excitement. I've been watching the traffic on your socials. Whatever you're doing in London, keep doing it. Your engagement rates are through the roof. The words felt like ice water. Her humiliation was already trending. Her moment of being put in her place was already being consumed as entertainment. The very system that had created her was now feeding on her downfall, and her manager couldn't tell the difference between positive and negative attention as long as the numbers kept climbing. I have to go, she whispered into the phone, hanging up before her manager could respond, but the damage was done. The reminder of what her life had become, what she'd built her identity around, what she'd thought was important. She looked back at the guard and for the first time saw him not as content, but as a person. A person who had dedicated his life to something larger than himself. A person who stood in all weather, dealt with all kinds of people, maintained perfect discipline not for fame or money or followers, but for duty. The contrast was devastating. Here was someone who served others while she'd spent years convincing others to serve her attention. Here was someone who had mastered himself while she'd spent her time trying to master algorithms. Here was someone who understood that true strength came from discipline while she'd confused popularity with power. Madison took a step back from the guard, then another. The crowd began to sense that the confrontation was ending, that whatever lesson was being taught had been received. Phones were lowered, conversations resumed, the normal flow of tourist activity began to reassert itself. But for Madison, nothing would ever be normal again. She'd touched something sacred and been burned by it. Not by anger or violence, but by the simple, devastating truth that some things in the world were more important than content creation. As she walked away from the guard post, her expensive heels clicking against cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of history, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in years: shame. Not embarrassment at bad content or frustration with low engagement, but actual shame at who she'd become and what she'd tried to do. Behind her, the royal guard returned his attention to the horizon, his duty unchanged by the encounter. But ahead of her, Madison faced a question that would define the rest of her life. What kind of person did she want to be when the cameras stopped rolling? The answer would determine whether this moment became just another viral video or the beginning of something that actually mattered. The walk back to her car felt like the longest journey of Madison's life. Every step on those ancient cobblestones seemed to echo with the weight of her humiliation. The pink Lamborghini sat waiting for her 3 blocks away, as bright and attention-seeking as she had been just an hour earlier. But now it looked different. Garish, desperate, like a neon sign screaming for validation in a world that had moved beyond needing such obvious displays. She sat in the driver's seat for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The girl looking back at her was still physically the same. Same perfectly applied makeup, same carefully styled hair, same designer outfit chosen for maximum visual impact. But something fundamental had changed behind her eyes. The drive back to her hotel was a blur of London traffic and racing thoughts. Her phone lay silent on the passenger seat, its notifications muted for the first time in years. She couldn't bring herself to look at the messages, the comments, the inevitable explosion of content that other people had created from her moment of shame. But she couldn't avoid it forever. Back in her luxury hotel suite, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, Madison finally picked up her phone. The numbers were staggering, not in a good way. The hashtag INFLUENCER shut down was trending worldwide. Videos from dozens of different angles showed her encounter with the guard, each one capturing her entitled behavior and his devastating response. But the comments weren't what she expected. They weren't defending her or attacking British rudeness or rallying to support their favorite creator. Instead, they were something much worse. They were disappointed. "I used to look up to you," wrote one of her longtime followers. "But watching you treat that guard like a prop, I can't support this anymore. That guard has more dignity in his silence than you have in all your content," commented another. The criticism wasn't coming from her usual detractors or internet trolls. It was coming from her own audience, her carefully cultivated fan base, the people who had made her fortune possible. They were leaving, not in anger, but in disappointment. Not with harsh words, but with quiet unfollowing. Madison watched her follower count drop in real time. Not dramatically, not in a massive exodus, but steadily, consistently, like water draining from a cracked vessel. Each number that disappeared represented someone who had decided she no longer reflected their values or deserved their attention. But it was the video messages that hurt the most. Young girls, some as young as 12, recording themselves talking about how they had wanted to be like Madison. How they had practiced her dances, copied her outfits, dreamed of having her life. And how watching her behavior at the palace had made them reconsider what kind of person they actually wanted to become. "I do and want to be famous if it means treating people like they do and matter," said one 13-year-old girl, her voice trembling with the kind of moral clarity that only children possess. "I want to be someone who makes the world better, not someone who makes everything about myself." The words cut deeper than any professional criticism could have. Madison realized that her influence had extended far beyond entertainment. She had been shaping young minds, setting examples, teaching lessons about how to treat others and what to value in life. And she had been teaching all the wrong things. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the guard's eyes, about that single word that had carried such authority, about the disappointment in the crowd's faces. She thought about her childhood before the followers and the fame and the constant pressure to perform. When had she stopped being a person and become a brand? When had she started seeing other people as content opportunities rather than human beings? The next morning brought more bad news. 3 major brand partnerships had been terminated overnight. Her talent agency had called an emergency meeting. Her parents, who lived off the income from her social media success, were demanding answers. The empire she had built was cracking, and the foundation it had been built on, pure entertainment value without any deeper meaning, was proving insufficient to weather this kind of crisis. But something else was happening too. Messages were arriving from a different kind of follower. People who respected what the guard had done, veterans who understood duty, young people who were tired of influencer culture and wanted to see authentic responsibility instead of performative rebellion. "Thank you for showing us what happens when entitlement meets real dignity," wrote a former soldier. "Maybe this will help people understand that some things are sacred. Your humiliation gave me courage to quit my own toxic social media habits," shared a college student. "Watching you get put in your place made me realize I needed to put myself in my place too." Madison read these messages with growing amazement. Her failure was inspiring people. Her moment of being stopped was encouraging others to examine their own behavior. The content that was destroying her career was somehow making the world a little bit better. She thought again about the guard, about his commitment to something larger than himself, about his willingness to maintain standards even when it was difficult or unpopular, about the dignity that came not from being seen and celebrated, but from doing what was right regardless of who was watching. For the first time in years, Madison began to consider what her life might look like if it was built around service rather than self-promotion. What if she used her remaining platform not to entertain, but to educate? What if she took responsibility for the example she set instead of hiding behind the excuse that she was just having fun? The decision came suddenly, but it felt inevitable. Madison opened her camera app one more time, but this wasn't going to be another dance video or fashion post or lifestyle content. This was going to be something completely different. "Hey guys," she began, but her voice was different now. Quieter, more thoughtful, stripped of the performative energy that had defined her content for years. "Madison here, and I need to talk to you about what happened at Buckingham Palace yesterday." She spoke for 15 minutes without stopping, without editing, without worrying about lighting or angles or engagement rates. She talked about entitlement and respect and the difference between being famous and being worthy of attention. She talked about the guard who had taught her more in one word than years of social media success had managed to do. "I'm going to be taking a break," she concluded. "I need to figure out who I want to be when I'm not performing for you. And maybe when I come back, if I come back, I'll have something worth saying instead of just something worth watching." She posted the video and then did something she hadn't done in years. She turned off her phone and went for a walk. Not to create content, not to be seen, not to perform for anyone, just to think. Behind her, the responses to her video were already pouring in. Some were angry at losing their entertainment source, but many more were proud of her growth, hopeful for her future, grateful for her honesty. And somewhere in London, a royal guard continued his duty, unaware that his quiet dignity had changed a life, inspired millions, and proven once again that some things in this world matter more than all the followers money can buy. The influence had finally learned what it meant to be influenced by something greater than herself.